When everyone built wide, he built up Rabun County, North Georgia. The year was 1849. Along every creek bend and forest edge, the same sound echoed through the mountains, the dull, steady rhythm of axes biting into green timber. Families had arrived from every direction, each racing the calendar, each knowing the same hard truth. Winter did not wait. Logs were dragged, peeled, and stacked into the only shape most frontiersmen trusted. Long, low, wide. Cabins stretched 20 by 30 feet, sometimes larger. Always single-story, with cramped sleeping lofts pressed beneath steep roofs. It was the frontier formula. Proven. Familiar. Safe. Build wide. Keep the fire low. Trap the heat. Men repeated it the way sailors repeat prayers. So when one newcomer quietly announced he would build up instead of out, laughter followed him across the valley. His name was Angus MacLeod, a Scottish stonemason, recently arrived, with hands shaped by chisels rather than axes. While others argued over log lengths and roof pitch, MacLeod unrolled a simple plan scratched onto a pine board. A stone tower, 36 feet tall, 16 feet square, 3 full stories stacked vertically. Same total living space as everyone else's cabin, just arranged in a way no one trusted. They stared at the drawing like it was a joke told in a foreign language. A grain silo, someone muttered. Waste of stone, said another. You'll freeze halfway to the clouds, warned a third. Frontier wisdom spoke loudly that day. Heat spreads sideways, not up. Stone holds cold. Wood breathes warm. Even Joseph Ridge, a Cherokee elder who had survived winters in these mountains long before any white cabin stood there, shook his head slowly. Stone remembers winter, he said. Wood remembers fire. MacLeod did not argue. He had learned long ago that explaining physics to men who trusted tradition more than measurement was like describing snow to someone born south of it. Instead, he nodded. And the next morning, while others raised walls in weeks, he began quarrying stone from the creek bed that cut through his claim. By summer, the difference between MacLeod and his neighbors was impossible to ignore. Their cabins rose fast, 3 months, sometimes less. Roofs went on. Fields were cleared. Families moved inside and turned their attention to corn and livestock. MacLeod worked alone, stone by stone, wall by wall. No hurry. His foundation sank deep, anchored to bedrock. His walls grew thick, 18 inches at the base. Mortar was burned in a kiln he built himself, lime and patience mixed in equal measure. Children dared each other to run past the construction site. Adults shook their heads at the wasted time. By autumn, the nickname had stuck. The silo. It followed him to the trading post, to church gatherings, to every conversation about winter. Most assumed they would be watching a lesson in what not to do. No one expected the lesson to turn on them. By October, frost crept into the valleys. Neighbors lit their hearths for the season, settling into the long routine of feeding firewood from dawn until sleep. MacLeod moved into his tower alone. No celebration, no approval, just stone, height, and quiet confidence. What no one realized, not yet, was that the question facing Rabun County was no longer who built fastest. It was who understood heat. And winter was already on its way to answer that question. What frontier wisdom got wrong about heat frontier wisdom was not foolish. It was hard-earned, forged by cold hands, empty bellies, and winters that killed the careless. But wisdom, when repeated long enough, can quietly turn into habit. And habit, when never questioned, becomes blind. By 1849, nearly every family in Rabun County believed the same thing about warmth. Heat belonged near the ground. Spread it wide. Keep the roof low. Build long cabins so the fire could reach every corner. It felt logical. You could stand beside the hearth and feel the warmth push outward, licking along the log walls. When the fire burned high, the room felt alive. When it died, the cold crept back in like a thief. So men learned to fight winter by force. More wood, bigger fires, longer nights feeding the flames. What they did not realize was that they were heating space, not structure. Angus MacLeod had seen the consequences of that mistake before, an ocean away. In Edinburgh, he had worked inside stone buildings that looked impossibly tall to frontier eyes. Tenements where dozens of families stayed warm through winters that starved coal supplies and punished waste. Those buildings did not rely on roaring fires. They relied on memory. Stone remembered heat. Wood forgot it the moment the flame died. On the frontier, Log cabins leaked warmth in ways no one could see. Heat rose from the hearth, climbed into the rafters, and pooled uselessly above sleeping lofts. From there, it slipped out through ridge seams, imperfect chinking, and thin roof boards that offered little resistance to wind-driven cold. Men burned wood to replace heat that never should have escaped. They cursed bad timber. They blamed poor chimneys. They swore winter had grown harsher. But the flaw was older than the cold. It was geometry. Wide buildings lose heat faster than tall ones. Thin walls bleed warmth faster than thick mass. And fires placed against exterior walls waste energy fighting the outdoors. MacLeod understood something few frontier builders had ever been taught. Heat behaves like water. It follows paths. It pools where allowed. And if you give it no direction, it escapes wherever it can. In Scotland, masons did not ask fire to fight the wind. They asked stone to hold the heat long after the fire was gone. MacLeod's neighbors believed stone was cold because they only felt it before it was heated. They touched frozen rock in winter and felt death beneath their palms. What they never considered was what happened after stone was warmed. And given time, stone absorbs heat slowly, but it releases it even slower. That delay was not a weakness. It was the advantage. A thick stone wall, once heated, became a silent stove, radiating warmth hour after hour without consuming another stick of wood. MacLeod's tower was designed around that truth. Not speed, not comfort on day one, but survival measured over months. While frontier cabins flared hot and cold like a heartbeat, his tower was meant to breathe slowly, steady, relentless, unimpressed by the night. There was another belief MacLeod quietly rejected, the idea that height was dangerous. Most settlers feared tall interiors because warm air rose away from the hearth. They watched heat vanish into lofts and assumed height itself was the enemy. MacLeod knew better. Height was not the problem. Uncontrolled height was. If warm air rose and had nowhere useful to go, it was wasted. But if that same air was guided, drawn upward through living spaces, past stone that could absorb its energy, it became an engine. What frontier builders saw as loss, MacLeod saw as motion. Upward movement was not waste. It was circulation. By the time the first hard frosts settled into Rabun County, MacLeod's tower stood complete. No one had stepped inside yet. From the outside, it looked severe, unforgiving, almost medieval against the soft lines of log cabins. Most assumed it would be unbearable. Cold stone, tall walls, heat racing upward and disappearing into nothing. They believed winter would teach MacLeod the lesson they already knew. What they did not understand, what winter was about to make painfully clear, was that frontier wisdom had been fighting the wrong battle. Winter does not defeat those who burn the most wood. It defeats those who misunderstand heat. And the mountains were about to deliver proof no argument could undo. The walls that everyone mocked if Angus MacLeod had rushed, his neighbors might have forgiven him. If his tower had gone up quickly, if stone had stacked itself the way logs did, people might have believed there was sense in it. But MacLeod worked slowly, deliberately. Each morning, while smoke rose from cabin chimneys across Rabun County, he walked to the creek with a hammer and iron wedges, selecting fieldstone the way a carpenter selects timber, by weight, by grain, by how it would behave under pressure. He did not build walls. He built mass. The foundation went first. 4 feet down, 3 feet thick, anchored into bedrock. Above it, the tower rose with walls 18 inches thick at the base, tapering slightly as they climbed. Every stone was fitted by hand, set in lime mortar burned in a hillside kiln MacLeod tended himself. Neighbors scoffed at the thickness. "Stone like that will never warm," they said. "You're building a cold cellar to live in." They had no idea they were watching a heat battery being assembled. Most frontier cabins placed their hearth against an outside wall. It was easier to vent smoke, easier to build, easier to explain. MacLeod rejected that practice entirely. His hearth sat at the center of the ground floor, wrapped on all sides by stone. When he built the firebox, he thought not about flame, but about contact. Every inch of stone touching that hearth was stone that would absorb heat. Every minute of cooking was a minute spent charging the tower's thermal mass. The kitchen was not designed for comfort alone. It was the engine room. Above it, MacLeod laid heavy oak beams and plank floors, but not tightly sealed. Narrow gaps were left between boards, invisible unless you knew to look. They were not mistakes. They were passages. Warm air, once created, was given permission to rise. The second floor served as workshop and storage. No fireplace, no chimney, nothing that suggested it should ever be warm. Yet it was designed to receive heat, not generate it. Stone walls surrounded the space on all four sides, absorbing excess warmth from air rising below. The floors above and below acted as slow valves, regulating movement rather than blocking it. And then there was the third floor, the space everyone said would freeze first. McLeod made it his bedroom. By the time heat reached that level, it had already passed through 2 floors of stone and wood, shedding sharp edges, slowing, deepening. What remained was not flame heat, but stored warmth. The third floor held a small auxiliary fireplace, rarely used. Its purpose was not survival, but comfort on the coldest nights. McLeod did not expect it to carry the load. The tower itself was meant to do that. As the walls climbed higher, so did the ridicule. Children ran past the site shouting, "Silo." Men counted months aloud. Women whispered that pride was blinding the Scotsman. Materials alone cost more than double a log cabin. Time stretched into a full year. By the time the roof went on, most neighbors had already harvested crops and stacked winter wood. McLeod stood alone. Even the help he needed to raise the roof had to be hired from outside the county. No one wanted their hands associated with the mistake they were sure was coming. By October of 1850, when McLeod finally moved into the completed tower, something colder than winter had settled around him. Silence. Invitations stopped. Nods replaced conversation. His tower became a warning rather than a curiosity, a monument to foreign stubbornness. And yet, on the first morning frost glazed the valley, something strange happened. While neighbors fed their hearths through dawn and dusk, McLeod lit a small kitchen fire at sunrise, cooked his meal, and banked the coals. Then he went about his day. By evening, the tower was still warm. Not from flame, but from memory. No one noticed yet. But winter was drawing closer. And stone, once warmed, does not forget easily. The winter that exposed the lie winter did not arrive all at once. It crept. First came the frost, thin, silver, harmless looking. Then the mornings grew quieter, the air heavier, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. By November of 1850, Rabun County had settled into the season everyone believed they understood. Cabin doors stayed shut. Achtstedli. Axes rang from dawn to dark. Men measured winter by cords of wood. 1 cord per month in a normal year. 2 if the season turned cruel. No one expected what came next. The first real cold arrived without warning. Overnight temperatures dropped well below freezing and refused to rise. Wind swept down from the higher ridges, pushing cold through chinking gaps and under doors that had never sealed properly. Inside the cabins, warmth rose from the hearth and vanished into the lofts like smoke into the sky. Families learned the familiar rhythm. Wake before dawn. Stoke the fire. Cook quickly. Split more wood. Let the fire die for even an hour, and the room lost its heat like water spilled onto frozen ground. Yet in McLeod's tower, something unsettling was happening. He lit his kitchen fire at sunrise, cooked his meal, then banked the coals and let the flames die. By mid-morning, the tower was still warm. Not glowing, not hot, just steady. When evening came, he climbed the narrow stone steps to his bedroom and slept without piling on extra blankets. The temperature did not swing. It held. No one noticed at first. People assume cold is shared equally. But by December, the difference could no longer be ignored. On a morning when the outside temperature fell to 12 degrees below freezing, McLeod descended his tower steps in a wool shirt, his breath barely visible indoors. His bedroom thermometer, brought from Scotland years earlier, read 68 degrees. 200 yards away, Klaus Zimmermann was already awake, splitting kindling in the dark. His cabin had dropped to 38 degrees overnight despite burning logs until midnight. The contrast was not subtle. It was humiliating. Cabins across Rabun County were losing the same battle. Heat flared near the hearth, then died quickly once fires were banked. Loft spaces stayed cold, forcing families to sleep in layers of wool and hide. Firewood disappeared at an alarming rate. Men who planned for winter carefully found themselves burning through supplies weeks ahead of schedule. And yet, McLeod's routine never changed. Morning fire for cooking. Coals banked by mid-morning. Evening fire for supper. That was it. No all-night burning. No frantic tending. The tower stayed warm anyway. By mid-December, people began to talk. Quietly at first. Some said McLeod was burning secret fires upstairs. Others claimed hidden flues ran inside the walls. A few whispered about tricks from the old world, things Americans had never been taught. But those explanations fell apart the moment anyone stood inside the tower. There was no roar of flame, no smoke, no smell of excess fuel, only warmth. A warmth that lingered long after the hearth went dark. Then winter tightened its grip. Snow came in heavy, blinding storms that buried cabins and drifted against doors. Temperatures stayed below zero for days at a time. Cabins that had survived every previous winter began to fail. Hearths burned constantly, but rooms never quite warmed. Water froze indoors. Bread dough refused to rise. Families began sleeping in shifts to keep fires alive. Woodpiles shrank faster than anyone had imagined possible. And still McLeod's tower held. On mornings when neighbors scraped ice from inside walls, his stone interior felt dry and calm. The lie was no longer deniable. It was not that winter had grown worse. It was that the old way of fighting it had finally met its limit. By the time January approached, something had changed in Rabun County. Men no longer laughed when they looked at the tower. They stared, and they wondered quietly, desperately, what they had misunderstood all along. This stupid wall trick, the neighbors called it foolish because they could not see it working. There were no gears, no pipes, no hidden chambers, just walls. Thick, silent, unremarkable walls. What Angus McLeod understood, and what frontier wisdom had never taught, was that heat does not behave like a wild thing that must be beaten into submission. It behaves like water. It flows, it pools, and it obeys paths whether you acknowledge them or not. McLeod's tower was not heated by fire. It was heated by time. Every morning, when McLeod cooked his breakfast, the fire in his kitchen burned for roughly 2 hours. That fire did 3 jobs at once. First, it cooked his food. Second, it heated the air. Third, and most important, it heated stone. Hundreds of cubic feet of it. The hearth was wrapped in masonry on all sides. Heat did not rush past the stone on its way to the chimney. It was forced to soak in. Stone absorbs heat slowly. That slowness is its power. While a log cabin wall warms quickly and cools just as fast, stone takes hours to reach temperature. And once there, it refuses to give that heat back all at once. McLeod was charging a battery. Once the stone warmed, the rest followed naturally. Warm air rose from the kitchen and slipped through the narrow gaps in the floorboards above. Not drafts, not leaks, but controlled openings. The air did not escape. It climbed. On the second floor, that warmth met more stone, which absorbed excess heat and radiated it steadily into the room. The temperature never spiked. It simply rose, then stayed. By the time the air reached the 3rd floor, it had slowed, softened, and concentrated. This was not the sharp heat of flame. It was stored warmth. That was the secret the neighbors missed. They believed heat had to be kept close to the fire. McLeod let it travel. The tower's vertical shape mattered as much as the stone itself. In wide cabins, heat spread thin and weak across large spaces, leaking out wherever it found a crack. The taller the ceiling, the more warmth gathered uselessly above sleeping lofts before escaping through the roof. McLeod's tower did the opposite. It stacked space instead of spreading it. Each floor became part of a rising column of warmth. Stone walls narrowed slightly as they climbed, gently concentrating heat rather than letting it disperse. Nothing was wasted. Every unit of heat generated in the kitchen did work, first warming the ground floor, then feeding the floors above, then radiating back through the stone long after the fire died. This was the part that shattered frontier belief. McLeod did not burn more wood. He burned less. One morning fire. One evening fire. Total consumption, little more than a cord per month, even in deep winter. Neighbors burned 2, sometimes 3. They fought cold by adding fuel. McLeod defeated it by refusing to let warmth escape. When Klaus Zimmermann finally asked for an explanation, McLeod did not speak in theories. He demonstrated. He lit the kitchen fire and held his hand above the floorboards. Heat moves like water, he said simply. Give it a path, it follows. Trap it against cold air, and it dies. On the 2nd floor, Zimmermann felt the walls warming, slowly, deliberately. On the 3rd floor, he stood in a room that stayed above 60 degrees with no fire burning anywhere near it. Stone remembered. Firewood disappeared, and the tower stayed warm. The stupid wall trick was not magic. It was patience, mass, and respect for how heat truly behaves. McLeod had not built a warm house. He had built a system, and winter had only just begun testing it. When pride finally broke, pride survives many things. It survives hunger. It survives exhaustion. It even survives cold, up to a point. But there comes a night when pride must choose between standing firm and letting someone freeze. That night came to Rabun County in January of 1851. The storm arrived before dawn, carried on a wind that screamed through the valleys like a living thing. Snow fell sideways, driven hard enough to sting exposed skin. By mid-morning, the temperature had dropped to 18 degrees below zero. And it stayed there. Cabins that had limped through December failed within hours. Hearths demanded wood every 2 hours. Chimneys iced over. Smoke backed into rooms already heavy with breath and fear. By the second day, families began burning furniture. By the third, they began burning hope. Klaus Zimmermann had planned carefully. He had rationed wood. He had sealed chinks. He had done everything frontier wisdom demanded. It was not enough. On the fourth night, his fire died while he slept. When he woke before dawn, the inside of his cabin had fallen near freezing. Frost coated the walls. His youngest child's skin had taken on a pale, waxy look that no parent ever forgets. Zimmermann did not argue with himself. He wrapped his daughter in every scrap of wool he owned, woke his family, and stepped into the storm. 200 yards. That was all that separated stubborn pride from survival. Angus MacLeod opened the tower door without a word. He did not say, "I told you so." He did not explain physics. He did not demand apologies. He stepped aside. Inside, the kitchen already sat at 55 degrees from the morning fire. Stone walls radiated quiet warmth. The child stopped shivering within minutes. MacLeod added wood to the hearth and began cooking breakfast, for 6 instead of 1. That was the moment Rabun County changed. Word spread quickly. Cold makes messengers out of desperate people. By the next morning, a widow arrived with her children. Her cabin had frozen solid after the fire died overnight. The following day, Joseph Ridge appeared with his grandsons. The Cherokee elder had survived more winters than any man in the county. He had trusted methods passed down through generations. That winter exceeded all of them. Ridge said nothing when he entered the tower. He sat near the stone wall, rested his palm against it, and closed his eyes. The wall was warm. Not hot. Not burning. Just alive with stored heat. He stayed until evening. By the third night of the storm, 11 people crowded MacLeod's ground floor. Children slept near the hearth. Adults sat against stone walls that continued giving warmth long after the fire was banked. Outside, the blizzard howled. Inside, people lived. No one spoke of foolish towers anymore. They spoke of survival. MacLeod never made speeches, but his routine never changed. Morning cooking fire, banked coals, evening supper fire. That was all. The tower did the rest. Temperatures held steady, 60s upstairs, 50s below, even as outside readings stayed far below zero. Cabins across the county failed. The tower did not. When the storm finally broke 7 days later, Rabun County emerged changed. Not just by cold, but by humility. Men who had mocked stone now ran hands along warm walls. Women who had burned furniture now asked questions. And the lesson was no longer abstract. It had names. It had faces. It had children who had slept warm because someone built differently. Pride had broken, not with words, but with temperature. What spread after the snow-melted spring of 1851 did not arrive with celebration. It arrived with scars. Cabins leaned crooked from ice damage. Woodpiles were gone. Fields lay uncleared because men had spent the winter feeding fires instead of planting crops. But something else had survived the cold. An idea. No one called it foolish anymore. When the ground finally thawed, the first sound of the new season was not birds. It was stone being struck with iron. Klaus Zimmermann was the first to begin. He did not attempt a full tower. He knew his limits, and he knew his tools. Instead, he quarried enough stone to build a square addition onto his log cabin. 16 feet across. Walls 16 inches thick. A hearth placed at the center. It was not elegant. It was effective. By autumn, his family lived primarily in the stone room, letting warmed air drift through cut openings into the old cabin. That winter, Zimmermann burned nearly half the wood he had the year before. Others followed. Some added stone chimneys thick enough to store heat. Some rebuilt hearths away from exterior walls. Some simply stacked stone against existing cabin walls. Learning through experiment what MacLeod had measured from the beginning. No one argued anymore. They observed. Joseph Ridge's adaptation ran deeper. The Cherokee elder blended stone mass into traditional winter lodges. Low earth-covered forms strengthened with masonry placed where fire met structure. Stone remembered the sun. Earth shielded the wind. Fire moved through both. Ridge taught the method quietly, passing it through families who had lost much during removal and needed efficiency more than pride. A hybrid tradition was born. By the next building season, 3 full towers rose near MacLeod's original claim. They were not exact copies. Each builder adjusted proportions, height, and layout to suit their land. But all shared the same principles. Mass before flame, height before width, paths for heat. Word traveled beyond Rabun County. A newspaper in Augusta ran a short piece describing Scottish heating methods that saved fuel during the blizzard. Sketches circulated. Letters were written. MacLeod became something he never sought to be. A reference. Men who had once mocked him now asked him to check mortar mixes and wall thickness. He answered patiently, measuring stone volume with his hands, explaining airflow with gestures rather than lectures. By 1856, the change was measurable. Fuel consumption dropped across the county. Winter illness declined. No child froze to death in the following severe seasons. Log cabins still stood, but fewer stood alone. Stone had joined them. MacLeod recorded his observations in letters to Scotland. Simple notes. No pride. Height moves heat better than width. Stone holds what wood cannot. Fire should work once, not endlessly. Those letters survived. They would matter later. By the time new settlers arrived in the late 1850s, they found a county that built differently. Not faster. Smarter. Winter no longer ruled the conversation. It was planned for. And the tower, once mocked, stood quiet and unchanged, doing what it had always done. Holding warmth. Waiting. Why this still matters. Angus MacLeod did not live to see his tower become famous. He never asked for recognition. Never patented a method. Never called what he built an invention. To him, it was simply masonry done honestly, guided by physics instead of opinion. Years later, when he was already an old man, MacLeod wrote to a nephew back in Scotland. They called it foolish, he said, building up instead of out. But foolish is heating the roof when you need to heat the bed. That sentence outlived him. MacLeod's tower still stands today. It has been repaired, repointed, lived in by people who no longer know his name. But the stone remembers. Modern thermal studies, conducted more than a century later, confirmed what frontier families learned the hard way. The upper floors of the tower remain 25 to 30 degrees warmer than nearby single-story structures, using the same amount of fuel. Less wood, more warmth. Same winter. Nothing magical. Just mass, height, and patience. The lesson MacLeod left behind is not really about stone. It is about how people approach problems. Frontier settlers burned more wood because that was what everyone had always done. They fought winter harder instead of thinking differently. MacLeod asked a quieter question. Where does the heat go? And then he built an answer that winter itself could not argue with. We still make the same mistake today. We heat wide spaces we don't occupy. We chase comfort with more fuel instead of better design. We trust habit more than measurement. The frontier did not survive because people worked harder. It survived because occasionally someone worked smarter. Someone willing to look foolish long enough for the truth to become obvious. Stone remembers heat. Height gives it direction. And winter, whether in 1851 or today, always reveals what works. The men who laughed at the tower learned something that year. Cold does not care about tradition. Fire does not reward effort. And physics never bends for opinion. If you value stories like this, where forgotten knowledge meets hard winter truth, consider subscribing. There are more lessons buried in stone, wood, and quiet ingenuity. And they are still warming lives, long after the hands that built them are gone.